Brandon Ingram, Julius Randle, D'Angelo Russell, Zach LaVine, and now Jimmy Butler. What do all of these players have in common? Nobody wants them. Well, at least for the value that they perceive that they have in the market space, which is a new concept that we're starting to see in the NBA, in large part due to a new CBA that has really changed the value in the market space for a lot of players. And honestly, this is a new development that I know for a fact a bunch of teams were not anticipating whatsoever. Now, for those who are unaware, in my last video, I talked about Jimmy Butler, his contract negotiations that has seemed to stall out with the Miami Heat, and how his perceived value in the NBA is completely different from where he views it, which has left him in a bit of a predicament where who knows what his future may be, not only with the Miami Heat, but with really any team in the NBA, and how much he is truly valued to whatever franchise that he signs to. And this concept of organizations hesitating and properly contextualizing the true value of certain players in the NBA is so new that it really intrigued me. Throughout the entire offseason, there have been several rumors about Zach LaVine and a team that he could potentially be traded for. However, Chicago is still stuck with him. And it was even more interesting that you had certain teams like the Golden State Warriors that was rumored to potentially add Zach LaVine to their roster, but they were literally willing to allow Chris Paul and Klay Thompson to walk for nothing before they added LaVine to their team. But in my opinion, the most interesting talking point throughout his entire offseason is that Brandon Ingram, who's in his mid-20s, entering the best years of his career, cannot find himself receiving a contract extension from a Pelicans team that, in all honesty, is like just one healthy season away from making a lot of noise in a very competitive Western Conference. And it's almost seemed as if like they could just allow him to walk for nothing. Now, why exactly is all this important? Well, it's because thanks to a new CBA, not only are there damaging implications of what this means for some of the players that I talked about, but also for some organizations who find themselves in very similar situations in which they overpaid certain players. Now, before I go into any deep details about all of this, of course, you have to have some background knowledge about the CBA and payrolls and what exactly has changed over the last 10 to 15 years. Now, I'm going to be brief with this, so please forgive me if you feel like I'm missing some information, but I'm just trying to hit the keynotes. First, what everyone needs to understand that back in the day when it came to the salary cap in the NBA, it really didn't increase that much on a year-to-year basis. Between 2006 to 2015, the salary cap in the league went from $49.5 million and only increased to $63 million by the time we got to 2015. And throughout multiple years throughout that stretch, the salary cap practically stayed the same on a year-to-year basis. Because of this, the value that a player had in year 1 was more than likely going to be the same value that a player had in year 2 and 3 and 4 of their contract, and so the type of money that was handed out was fairly consistent on a year-to-year basis. However, as many of us know, the salary cap started to spike, started to see significant changes. The most infamous one happened in the 2017 offseason when the salary cap went from $70 million in 2016 to $94 million in 2017. Literally $24 million within 1 year's time frame. And since then, the salary cap has jumped from $94 million all the way up to $140 million, which is crazy because I don't think anybody anticipated that level of increase from the salary cap within a finite amount of time. Now, of course, that level of increase came with its side effects. The most noteworthy one is a level of reckless spending from owners and general managers across the league within that time frame that resulted in players like Timofey Mozgov being significantly overpaid, and also other general managers and owners feeling like they were at significant disadvantages because they knew they were not going to be able to spend the type of money that other teams had the ability to do so. And because of that, we now have a new CBA that has introduced a level of restrictions, limitations, and penalties that span all the way from removing the ability to use an MLE, restricting certain teams on their ability to construct certain type of trades, and even devaluing draft picks that can extend all the way to like 7 years in advance. It's actually pretty crazy. But for the first time in like 15 years now, there seems to be an actual cap on the type of money that a lot of teams are willing to spend, which is now once more resulted in a level of hesitation and caution that has never really been seen from owners and GMs in quite some time. And of course, many people have theorized on how exactly was this going to change the landscape of the NBA. And it seems as if like there are two subsections of players whose values have not changed at all throughout this offseason. First, you have your role players who are still receiving the same money that they've always received. If anything, it has probably slightly increased. Shout out to Alex Hoops because he actually made an entire video outlining the concept of why role players are being paid so much money. And in short, short, the reason why it seems as if like they're getting paid a lot of money is because the salary cap continues to increase, but as always, they're making up around 10, 15, maybe 20% of a team's salary cap, which has not changed over the course of like 10 to 15 years. And to add on top of that information, I also want to add into this conversation, another reason why role players are not losing their value is because they're actually becoming more valuable. Thanks to advanced analytics and just the power of three-point shooting, a player like Derek Fisher, who back in the day would take an abnormal amount of long twos, is now taking an abnormal amount of three-pointers, which means that on a per possession basis, role players are now producing more points than they did back then. Also, defensive-oriented role players are much more versatile in today's game than they were back in the day, but possibly the biggest reason why role players are just more valuable in today's game is because skill sets in today's game are dictated on what you are able to do, not necessarily the position that you play. Back in the day, if you weren't a point guard, the concept of you being a ball handler was practically non-existent. But in today's game, there are more positions that are handling the ball, initiating offense, creating opportunities not only for themselves, but for everyone else, and in turn, meaning that practically everyone on the floor has the capability of being a creator to a certain extent. A great example of what this looks like, obviously, are the Boston Celtics. You have an organization that has built a roster where at practically every position, you have someone who is a shot creator or someone who is shooting threes at an abnormal rate, which has generated a level of offense that is really, really difficult to keep up with, while also producing very versatile defenders who can switch and defend multiple positions. And more than likely, that's what the rest of the league is going to look like moving forward. So in short, role players more talented, produce more than they did in prior years. And so their value, even in a new CBA that is heavily restricting certain teams on the type of money that they can spend, they're still going to receive the same money that they've always, if not more. I don't think I need to really explain the value of a Luka Doncic, a Shea, a Jokic, a Giannis, a AD, a LeBron, KD, Curry. You kind of get the concept. If you are a top 15 player in the NBA, or if you have the talent and the potential, then you're going to receive a max or even a super max contract. That makes sense. Now, there is a subsection of players who also receive a max contract that may not fit within the mode of being a top 15 player. And those players, in all honesty, should really find themselves in the pseudo-star category. But the reason why they receive a max contract is because they find themselves in a very unique situation where they can increase the ceiling of what their team is able to produce on a year-to-year basis to title contention level. And because of that, their value is also still perceived as a max contract player, even if they are not a top 15 player in the NBA. A great example of this is Jamal Murray. Of course, him being on the Denver Nuggets means that they are going to be a title contending team, and being able to reproduce that type of talent with really anyone in the NBA is going to be really, really difficult to do so. Another great example of this is Jaylen Brown to a certain extent, and I believe Kyrie Irving also fits within this dynamic as well. Which then leaves us with this subsection of players in the middle. Players who aren't good enough to be stars, franchise players, superstars for a team, and also are, quite frankly, just overqualified to be role players. And even if they do make an all-star team or two, or heck, even an all-NBA team, it's not necessarily because of their talent, or maybe it's a one-off that certainly doesn't occur enough to call them a perennial all-star. And these are the players that it seems as if like the new CBA has affected the most. And in large part because it's really hard to identify how valuable these players are to winning basketball unless they're in a very unique situation, similar to, once more, a Jamal Murray, a Jaylen Brown, and a Kyrie Irving. And this is where your Jimmy Butlers, your Julius Randles, your Brandon Ingrams, your D'Angelo Russells, your Zach LaVines fall under this umbrella. And moving forward, it's going to be very, very interesting to figure out how teams really value these players, in large part because, again, they're not good enough to be stars, and a lot of their value could more than likely be seen from a role player, especially someone to the level of like an OG Anunoby or maybe even a Mikal Bridges with the New York Knicks. You'd probably much rather be put in that position rather than paying someone like a Julius Randle a max or near max contract, and I believe that's why a lot of these players are in limbo right now, which wasn't happening like 5-7 years ago because max contracts were being handed out like hotcakes. You had players like CJ McCollum, Karl Anthony Towns, Michael Porter Jr., all receiving extensive max contracts just because their teams felt as if like it was necessary to retain talent, and they didn't really care what price it came at because there weren't the same level of restrictions that we see in today's market. And possibly the best example of this, and my Philly fans will will certainly agree to this, was Tobias Harris, somehow receiving the amount of money that he got paid, max contracts, for a player who was a fringe all-star. Didn't even make the all-star team, but fringe all-star level player. For him to have received the contracts that he did, grossly overpaid, never really performing to the status of the contract that he received, really was evident to the type of market that a lot of players had at that time period. And to show even further evidence of how damning a lot of those contracts were, players who are still under those contracts right now in this new CBA are so damaging to their team and their potential construction moving forward that I promise you, every single roster in the NBA who has one of those type of contracts under their cap is trying their damnedest to move it. And I honestly believe that buyer's remorse, that regret that certain owners and general managers have of some of the decisions that they made over the last 2 to 3 years before this new CBA kicked in, it's a huge reason why someone like a Julius Randle, someone like a Jimmy Butler, someone even like a Brandon Ingram have not received their contract extensions just yet. Jimmy Butler, you can certainly chalk it up to the fact that he is an older player and Miami can clearly see that there is no light at the end of the tunnel and they don't want to put themselves in a financial commitment that will never result into a championship because it doesn't really make any sense. And so moving forward in a different direction that's a bit more younger might just be the most sound decision out there. However, Julius Randle not receiving a contract extension, even though the New York Knicks have built around majority of what they've done over the past 3 to 4 years around his talent, is very, very interesting. And so if you are the Knicks, you have to ask yourself this question, that is it possible that a lot of what Randle provides to a team cannot just be duplicated with certain role players like OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges, which flushes out the roster, makes it much more well-rounded and balanced, and also leaves you a bit more financially flexible for another star that could truly increase the ceiling of what your team is trying to accomplish to title contention. And when you look at Brandon Ingram, very similar situation. Not good enough to be a franchise star, but overqualified to be a role player. And because of that dynamic, he finds himself somewhere in the middle. Once more, these players have been receiving an abnormal amount of money over the past 5-7 years now, and I'm pretty sure that's what he is anticipating to receive. But unfortunately, the Pelicans do not view him as a player that can put them over the top to title contending status. And they would probably go as far as to believe that a lot of what he provides to a team can be stretched out amongst 2 or 3 different players, such as Herb Jones and Trey Murphy, who are role players, but because of how much better role players have become over the past 2 to 3 years, they can still duplicate a lot of the value that these pseudo stars have been presenting to a lot of these teams over the last 10 years now. And so, unless they find themselves under the right circumstance, a very unique situation where they can increase the ceiling of a team to title contending status, I have a hard time believing that any of these players are ever going to receive the type of money that we saw a lot of them receive over the last 10 to 15 years. And it is a huge reason why any Minnesota Timberwolves fan will tell you that they cringe every single time they realize that Karl-Anthony Towns is the 8th highest paid player in the NBA in this upcoming season. Why Chicago Bulls fans are upset that Zach LaVine is a top 20 paid player in the NBA in this upcoming season. And why Phoenix Suns fans know for a fact that their window of opportunity of trying to win is very, very small because Bradley Beal is making up an abnormal amount of money for who he is on that team. He's the 5th highest paid player in the NBA, and we all know a lot of the production that all 3 of those players provide could be duplicated for a significant, and I do mean a significant less amount of money for all 3 of those teams. And if they're unwilling to move off of the evaluation that they perceive that they have, they're just not going to be wanted in the NBA. I have a hard time ever believing that. Man, all of this bad contract talks really wants me to like make a video, like a bad contract draft. Me and a couple other creators kind of collab, get together, and whoever has the highest payroll with the worst team wins the whole like drafting event or whatever, and y'all can determine who I collab with and y'all can determine like who has the worst team. If that's something that you're interested in, hit the thumbs up and let me know, like do bad contract draft down below in the comment section, and I'll try my hardest to kind of get that done. But I do believe that's a very interesting video. But besides that, for more content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button and notification bell. And until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.